Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Historical Society of Lake Worth's program this evening. We're very happy to have Ted Brownstein with us. He's a recognized expert on the early settlement of Jewell, and tonight he's going to be discussing four of the lesser-known pioneer families that lived near Fannie and Samuel James and the development that they helped create for Jewell. First of all, our Historical Society president, Steve Locke, would like to say a few words. Steve, are you on?
Thanks, Judy. You hear me okay?
We can.
Okay. Before we started tonight, since we don't get a chance to see many of you face to face this year, nevertheless, our 2021 season has been moving ahead, and I hope you've received our newsletter number 4, I think it is, put together by our Vice President Marion Cohn, who's been combing the 1913 Lake Worth Heralds, the founding years of the city, for various glimpses of a lifestyle and issues of the day in a section that we're calling Tidbits. And we're also regularly updating our Facebook page and our website. We've also asked on the website for your input, member or visitors' input, in something we're calling Our History or Personal View. So if you have an ancestor or a relative who's made some kind of contribution to the history of Lake Worth, whether it's social, political, religious, business, whatever, we'd certainly like to hear the story. And our email address for anybody who wants to communicate with us, it's obvious, but it's historicalsocietyLW@hotmail.com. In the meantime, just a couple of updates of things that we're doing in addition to these presentations. One is that many of you know that we commissioned a color tile mural last year on Jewell and the James family on the part of Tracy Rosa Peterson, who's actually with us tonight. And I'm happy to say that the mural is finished. We're in the process of mounting. We'll have a formal ceremonial unveiling, I'm sure, later in the spring. And there's also going to be a related state historical marker that Judy's working on that'll be installed in the spring as well. One other activity, some of you may also recall that in 2019, we had a presentation on the prehistoric archaeology of Lake Worth Beach. And as a follow-up, last year we commissioned a paper, research paper on pre-Columbian Lake Worth from the anthropologist Dorothy Block, and that is going to be our subject of our presentation in March. As Judy mentioned, the presentation tonight is from Ted Brownstein. Hardly needs any introduction. I'm sure everybody who was on the Zoom meeting tonight, he's been active in this community for over a decade. Co-founder of the Lake Worth Interfaith Network, heavily involved in the Martin Luther King committees, an expert on religion, author of several books on containing sacred texts and prayers across a whole range of faiths. But of course, as Judy mentioned, he's maybe most widely known to this audience because of his groundbreaking research regarding the settlement that preceded Lake Worth called Jewell. And Ted has not rested on his research or publication laurels. He continues to pursue the history of the area, the time, the Jameses and their neighbors. And this is a presentation tonight by Ted is especially appropriate as February is Black History Month. So Ted, take it away.
Well, thank you, Judy and Steve, for that warm welcome, and also want to acknowledge Marion Cohn and other friends who have contributed to this. History is, we're always standing on the shoulders of each other and trying to build on what each other do, so nobody can really take credit for the whole thing. Well, I discovered this. It just doesn't happen that way. We're going to talk about the establishment of Jewell as an Everglades community, agricultural community that was the predecessor of what became the city of Lake Worth. And it was a forgotten history for many reasons. Tidbits came up here and there about the couple Fannie and Samuel James was known, but not much else about the rest of the community. And I wanted to first get a little feeling from you, the audience, as to whether you've heard the presentation on the Jewell book talk, or seen the video that John Schneider did, or otherwise know a good bit about the Jewell, or how much we have background you need in order to put the other new elements in context. So how many of you, by show of hands, have heard something about it? Some of you are muted. You can always use the reactions and click a hand. About half of you or so know something about it. Okay, well, we have a lot of slides tonight, and we can go over some of them briefly, but we want to give context to what the Jewell community was like. So I'm going to start by screen sharing, and we'll get started. So here's my PowerPoint, and there's the start. So the community of Jewell was a forgotten settlement dated from 1885. Considering that this was Everglades in South Florida, the population was really, really scarce. In 1885, the state of Florida took a census and found 330 people in Martin, what is now Palm Beach, Broward, and Dade counties. So there was hardly anybody here. This particular map is from 1902, as you can see. And I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor? There's a Jewell right under Palm Beach. West Palm already existed, of course, by 1902, but notice no Lantana in there, and no Lake Worth. So the area was known as Jewell. There was never really an incorporated town of Jewell, but was a post office that was registered with the U.S. Postal Service, and that's where the name came from. So just giving a little context, what was here before the post office. The Aboriginal tribe here was known as the Jaeger, the Jaga. They were visited by the Spanish explorers, including Ponce de Leon. But we archaeologists have discovered a lot of remains and mounds and so forth from that period, and believe that the population was already decimated by the time Ponce de Leon came here in 1813. And Jaga disappeared completely due to disease, slave trading, and so forth by the 1730s. So the Seminoles then were the tribe that came into the area. A lot of them were runaways from the Trail of Tears, or otherwise fleeing into what was then Spanish Florida from the United States. And they were also mixed in runaway slaves, and it became the Black Seminoles. And there were a series of wars culminating. The largest of them was in the 1840s. And of course, the US troops pretty much decimated the Seminoles as well. And there were large farms that have been found that were reported on the barrier islands that were intentionally destroyed by federal troops. Actually, thousands of bushels of potatoes and things like that. So it's very productive agricultural land, as evidenced from even going back to that period. And the lake itself received the name by the surveyors that came in the wake of the war. So we call Lake Worth, both the body of water and the town get their name from General Worth from the Second Seminole War. There were a couple of early attempts at settlement of the area. Right after the war, the federal government passed what was called the Armed Occupation Act. That's because there never was a peace treaty with the Seminoles. And so the homesteaders were expected to defend themselves. The federal government wasn't promising to come to their defense. So the homesteaders were supposed to be armed and capable of fending off any attacks. There were 9 permits that were taken out for the shores of Lake Worth, but we're not really sure if anybody ever settled in the area. If they did, they didn't stay very long. And this area was, as far as we know, void of American settlers in the wake of the Armed Occupation Act. Didn't help very much. There was one gentleman that we know about by the name of Augustus Lang, who was a Confederate deserter up in Palm Beach. It's now Palm Beach. And he gardened and was a hermit. And he was here from 1863 until 1866 actually took them a year after the war was over to find out. Some explorers were down here and ran into him. And by the way, the war is over. So as a deserter, then he didn't have to fear of being arrested or anything any longer. And he took off as soon as he was able. And also in the wake of the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau made an attempt to help freed slaves get on their feet with the Southern Homestead Act of 1866. This again was a short-lived and relatively unsuccessful endeavor. Nobody that we know of in South Florida obtained any land under the Southern Homestead Act again. So this the whole region around the body of Lake Worth, going all the way up to the area that's Riviera Beach, and then down to what's now Hypoluxo or Boynton Beach, was as empty as far as we know of. One family arrived, the Pierces, in 1873. Hannibal Pierce had worked briefly on at the Jupiter Light, and then he came down with his family and settled on Manalapan Island. You can see H. Pierce and Hypoluxo Island, so they came down relatively close to our area across the water. And then another early arrival was Edwin Bradley. He came down with two children and had two more while he was down here. So there was a family of four that was there from 1875. So again, we can just see how thin the population was. You can see from this map, the bulk of the residents were up in what became Palm Beach. So here's a wonderful picture of the Pierce home out on Hypoluxo Island. It's now Manalapan. You can see how crude it is. They didn't have a lumber yard they could go to or any place to go for supplies, so they had driftwood that they worked with and built a palm frond roof and lived out on the island off their wits, hunting and some gardening, fishing, and so forth. They were really out here on their own, isolated. The name Black Diamonds was given to Fannie and Samuel James. They were of mixed race, dark-skinned, believed to be ex-slaves, and Fannie was the area's first postmaster. This particular monument is in front of the current post office on J Street and Lucerne. It was put there because at the time it was erected in 1999. Nobody really knew where the original post office was. They knew that the area had been named Jewell and that Fannie had been the postmistress, but didn't really know much else about it. So who were Fannie and Samuel James? Where did they come from? Why did they come here? Where was their homestead? Where was the post office? How did they live when they were here? Who were their neighbors? And since they were an African-American couple, it's logical to ask what were race relations like at that time here in South Florida after the Civil War. So this book is actually one book with two different covers. Pioneers of Jewell came out at the time of the centenary of the incorporation of Lake Worth in 2013. And this was a largely original research, filling in a lot of the blanks on who Fannie and Samuel were and what the community of Jewell was like. So the people that came here were farmers. As we mentioned, it was an agricultural community. They got land from the federal government under the Homestead Act, and people could get 160 acres under this federal law simply by living on it, constructing a home, and cultivating for 5 years. Although there was a way of using a technique called preemption, where if they paid, I think it was $1.25 an acre or something like that, they could get the land almost immediately. But people had to go up to the U.S. Land Office in Gainesville to file the application, as you can imagine, with no roads, no train down here in isolated conditions. Getting up to Gainesville was quite the task. They actually sailed up the coast to Jacksonville. Then there was a train from Jacksonville to Gainesville to file their claims to land down here. So we find in these homestead applications, which are available from the U.S. archives, handwritten copies of all the applications of the different settlers that came down here, telling us where they were born, what their trade was, why they came, how they did, how they improved the land, details about their home and their crops and so forth. So this was a rich source of information. And when it became digitized, we were able to get that information and fill in a lot of the blanks that were previously unknown about the Jewell community. So that's why we had original research in 2013, when in 1999, much of that information was unavailable. And one of the things we discovered that the Jameses actually took out 2 homesteads. How they were able to do this, we don't really know. But the first one was along the water, a mile of shoreline that basically runs from Lucerne or from the Lake Worth Bridge down south along the shoreline to 12th Avenue South now. It's about a mile. And then west to just the other side of Federal, probably M Street or L Street, somewhere in between there, north and south. Then they took out another 160 acres to the west. That's bounded again by Lucerne, 6th Avenue South this time, and then about F Street from the boundary of the other homestead. So they had quite a bit of land that they were able to acquire. And then later, actually, they purchased more land. And we found out, of course, that where Fannie and Samuel came from. Fannie came from a Granville County in North Carolina, was a heavy tobacco growing area, a lot of slaves and freed slaves in that area. And we learned that during the war, during the Civil War, our family migrated to an abolitionist town in Ohio, in Fayette County. And we have this from the census records and so forth that she went there. And we were recently able to fill in some blanks on Fannie's role in her family's flight to Ohio. So this came from the archives on ancestry.com, that one of her relatives, or actually her brother-in-law, William Anderson, enrolled in the Union Army after they were in Ohio. He was 44 years old, joined the infantry, and he was quite light-skinned. He was also of mixed race, described as having blue eyes, blonde hair, and a yellow complexion, but nevertheless in the colored troops, so he didn't pass as white. And interestingly enough, we have the record of his death. He died at Vicksburg in June of 1865. So this was long after the famous Battle of Vicksburg, but of course the Union troops were still occupying it, and he died of dysentery at that time. So in addition to having this history of Fannie's relatives in the Civil War, it's interesting that we discovered her role in this when Fannie's sister Betsy was making her application for a widow's pension to the basically the VA of the time. Fannie James testified that she was 10 years old and in the room when Betsy and William married, so they were legitimately married back in North Carolina. Back in 1853, Fannie would have been 10 years old at the time. And she signed her name as Fannie James rather than Fannie Jones. So Fannie was married and in Ohio in 1868. So we are able to have documentation placing her in Ohio at that time. And so she did accompany her family during the Civil War when they fled North Carolina, the Confederate territory, to Union territory in 1863. And here it is after the war. And Betsy's making her pension claim, and Fannie is documenting that. So we were able to learn fairly recently, thanks to the records on Ancestry.com, that confirming that Fannie not only was in Ohio, but she was married in 1868. In 1884, we have the first record of Samuel James, her husband, coming to South Florida here. His wife was back home in Cocoa Beach area, and Samuel was a carpenter, and he heard about the construction going on mostly in Palm Beach, so he came down with $50 in his pocket and to find work in December of 1884. And he met a very friendly gentleman by the name of Edwin Bradley, who was one of the few people living on the western shore of Lake Worth. Most of the people had settled out on the barrier island, and Edwin Bradley showed him around and encouraged him to take out a claim on the west shore of the lake. What's interesting about this is that after the Civil War, there was clamping down at the end of Reconstruction, once the federal troops left, and the reinstituting of discriminatory practices against anybody with African American blood. And there was this movement for former slaves or African Americans who might have been free prior to the war to take out homesteads and be self-sufficient and independent. So Fannie and Samuel ended up taking advantage of that when they took out their homestead claim. Just briefly, the conditions here were dismal. There was swamped land. It was really part of the Everglades that hadn't been drained. The heat and humidity were awful. As we said, if anybody had moved down here under the Armed Occupation Act or otherwise, they didn't stay, and there were no stores to buy lumber. All the transportation was by boat, as was the delivery of mail to the first post office. And so, as we said, Fannie and Samuel took out their first claim along the lake shore there, as this map shows the boundaries. They built a really small frame house, 14 by 23, dug a well, and planted crops that were reported in their application for homestead. And then they proceeded to do the South Florida thing and subdivide their property and sell it off. And so between 1887 and 1890, they sold the vast majority of their 186 acres to individuals, mostly speculators. A few people probably lived there and farmed it, but a lot of these people are known to have Palm Beach connections and bought the land on speculation. So there was one piece of land in their holding that they didn't sell, and this is where their home was and where the first post office was located. And so today, that's north of the Birthday Cake Castle in South Bryant Park. This was approximately a 6-acre parcel that they kept and didn't sell. So here's this rendition of what the place might have looked like. They had some lumber for the house. Samuel was a carpenter, and they probably had a shingle roof on the building, but we don't know for sure. It was hard getting supplies, but we believe it was probably a well-built little house at that time. And that's what the site looks like today. There's a picnic pavilion in the south end of Bryant Park. About half of the park is fill, so the house was probably back closer to Lakeside. And it's interesting that there was a neighbor just to the south of them, and the Jameses spun off the only residential lot to a woman by the name of Amanda Malvina Moore. She was a Black woman from Pike County, Alabama, and we find her with her family as an 11-year-old in the 1870 census. And she was apparently a friend of the Jameses, and they created this lot alongside the water just for her. And so there's a depiction of the little residential lot that went to Amanda Moore. And that's what it looks like today. Quite a change. That was what the Birthday Cake Castle, and the wall that you see in the lower left there is along the street at 5th Avenue South, and of course it runs to the water through the park there. That is now the boundary of the park, but this land was the first residential lot, the only residential lot that the Jameses created. Lantana was active in promoting settlement. You might probably know that Key Lime House was built in 1889 as a hotel, and there were residential and commercial lots there. So Lantana kind of leapfrogged the Jewell in development during this period. It's really interesting to talk about Mildred Gildersleeve. She lived on the far north end in what's now Riviera Beach, but she was born a slave, another African-American, but she served as midwife with Dr. Richard Potter, who lived out on Palm Beach Island with his brother in the area around the Southern Bridge now on the eastern end of that. And she was a midwife, and she traveled with Dr. Potter and delivered the children. It's very possible that she would have helped deliver the Bradley children down in Lantana. As we said, his two youngest kids were born after they moved to Florida. Logical to ask the question, well, did the Jameses and the Gildersleeves know each other? And we can guess that that was the case. It was a small community. People knew each other. Mildred traveled quite a bit, and we know that there was a mutual friends that they held. Dr. Richard Potter was the one that Mildred worked with, and he also signed some documents for the Jameses as a witness. And so they all knew each other well, and it's just hard to imagine that Fannie and Millie didn't run into each other. There's also another connection with Josiah Sherman, who was living up in the Riviera Beach area near the Gildersleeves, and he also was a farmer, and he had a farm very close to the hotel, the Oak Lawn House up there, close to where the Gildersleeves lived. And he also bought 70 acres from Samuel James to raise vegetables. So we have all these interconnections that point to the fact that she also probably was in their acquaintance and one of their neighbors. So the James' second homestead was taken out in 1888, just 4 years after arriving, and even before the Jewell post office was established. And this is the first picture we have of that house. So the picture actually dates to 1912, but it was the original James house. And they built a much larger home, much larger, 21 by 49. And they built a packing house for agriculture and grew pineapples on that land. So they didn't subdivide that second parcel as much as they did the first, but used it for agricultural purposes. When the train came, everything changed. Train came to West Palm Beach in 1894 with the breakers and Henry Flagler, and then was extended south to Miami 2 years later and affected our area in that period. And so the post office was moved west. Here's a second post office application showing the track from the James's second homestead, which already existed further west to the railroad track that was used to service the U.S. mail after the train came through, and the mail delivery was by train. So that's what that area looks like today, near where the drop-off would have been for the mail. And the post office was closed in 1903 when Samuel James became sick, and Fannie probably closed the post office to nurse him. But also a lot of attention had been, and the development had moved to Lantana. So the mail service was moved to Lantana in 1903 as well. Samuel died in 1909, leaving Fannie a widow. And there is an artist's conception of Fannie. She did have some money, as we said, from her business dealings, and so built a nice memorial to him with a stone and a picket fence. And here's an artist's conception of her. Notice there's no city around yet. This area was in the woods. Their second home was probably to the west of this, between the burial plot and the railroad track. And that's what that area looks like today. There's a nice wood frame house on there on the lot where Samuel was buried. And we know the exact location of this because when Fannie sold her land to the developer, she didn't sell the gravesite, but the city sponsored this radar survey, ground penetrating radar, looking for any remains. There's a story that their graves and the coffins were dug up in the 30s and thrown into the Intracoastal. And what the ground penetrating radar survey found pretty much confirmed that story to the extent that's possible. No coffin or human remains there, but they said there was a disturbance of the soil that was consistent with a burial. So very possible that we found the exact location, but no concrete evidence of remains and so forth. It's interesting to note that in the earlier period, during this homestead period, that there was good relations between the races at that time. And this is a little quote from 1898 from the local paper, The Tropical Sun, stating categorically that we believe in equal rights for all, special privileges to none. At this time, Jim Crow was really settling in northern and central Florida. The Klan was beginning to have its influence, but South Florida and the Keys remained open in the spirit of Reconstruction until around 1900, until the turn of the century. So the Palm Beach Farms Company came in as a developer. Interestingly enough, they were a Colorado corporation. Most of the country was pretty developed, most of the states established by this time. And they came in and started buying up land from the homesteaders, and Fannie sold out to them her remaining holdings that she hadn't subdivided and sold for, and we found the records in the county for $1,124 actually, which was a lot of money back then. And one of the ironies, of course, is that things had changed in the interim. When the town of Lake Worth was established in 1913, the Jim Crow laws were well in effect. Lake Worth was an all-white town, but in order to pass constitutional muster, they had to have separate but equal. So the town charter, this handwritten charter that still exists in the city clerk's office, stipulates that there were to be white residential districts in which no, quote, colored people could live, and colored residential districts in which no white people could live. And so this passed the constitutional muster under separate but equal, but there were no colored residential districts established between 1913 with the charter and 1926. So Fannie had to move out of town. And the city limit at that time was 12th Avenue South. And as a person of color, she couldn't live within the city boundary, but she acquired, or she moved onto a property with 1 acre and a quarter that we're calling her farmette in order to conform to the segregation laws at that time. I always thought it was curious that this is so close to what later became the Osborne community when the annexation went further south from 12th Avenue. There was a colored residential district established right kitty corner across Dixie Highway and to the south from her. And it was always curious why she chose that location. But we were able to find an interesting footprint of what's possibly her home from a 1928 map. The family and the estate owned the property until 1925. So this is only 3 years later. It's very possible that that was Fannie's home with an outbuilding and faced the train tracks and to the west there. And here is an artist's conception of Fannie in her 70s as a widow, tending her chickens. Her probate file says that she had 41 chickens and a rooster, and she was known as the Chicken Lady. And she also had a horse and buggy, and she was actually killed in a car accident going to West Palm Beach to talk to her lawyer, we presume, about her real estate transactions. In 1915, what's now Dixie Highway was called the County Road, and was unpaved, of course, and she was somehow killed en route to West Palm Beach. So this is a segregation era wall. I don't know how many of you have seen this along Wingfield Street. It's currently being repainted, and there's some marvelous art there. And one of the murals there is this picture of Fannie. This is just a block and a half away from where her third homestead was. And that's what the intersection looks like today. So right in the foreground, right in the middle of the street, was this acre and a quarter farmette that Fannie owned in her and lived in her elder years. And then the Osborne Color District, of course, was this smaller area. It was an unincorporated area at first between Lake Worth and Lantana when there were no people of color living in Lake Worth. And this was the segregated area. It was platted in 1914, not annexed to the city in 1926. And we made some interesting discoveries recently about who lived there contemporary with Fannie James. We found, I think Marion found these two clippings about the people who lived in the Osborne community before it was into the city. A man by the name of James Allen, who's described in the Lake Worth Herald as a Negro carpenter who lived in the area. And then a woman by the name of Mandy Gooden, who actually bought 2 homestead lots right by where New Hope Missionary Baptist Church is today. So this was in 1914. Fannie was still alive. So there was a small, as they call it, Negro settlement contemporary with Fannie's residence there. So it's probably why she selected to live near her community. There's a lot of history, and I wish we had time to go into this in more detail, but the Grant Chapel AME Church was originally established in Lantana. And there was a larger African-American community in Lantana and Boynton Beach that could have used this. And James Allen says that he helped to build this church for his people down in the Flatwood, west of the Lantana community that was already established with the Key Lime House and so forth. When Lantana was incorporated in 1921, all the Black population was forced out of the city limits, including this, what then was a long established church, moved up into the Osborne community. The AME denomination, of course, was very popular African Methodist Episcopal Church. And this church is still quite active in our city today. And then, of course, the Osborne community was expanded in stages over time to take in the area all the way up to 12th Avenue South. And during segregation, conditions were kind of harsh for the Black population. There were, as we mentioned, legally separated Black and white neighborhoods. There was that wall that divided the Osborne Color District from neighboring Whispering Palms neighborhood that was an all-white neighborhood, not a neighborhood, but a neighborhood. That the wall was built in the 1950s when that area was developed. There were separate schools for whites and Blacks. The whites went to currently Barton Elementary, and there was Osborne, a 3-room schoolhouse for the Black children. People are still living who remember going to school there in the late 1960s. Trudy Lowe, who was a student there, says that in her 4th grade class, there were 15 students in 1 textbook. So we can just imagine the level of education that it was hardly separate but equal at that time. There were separate drinking fountains downtown. There was a segregated color balcony at the movie theater downtown at the Lake Theater, and Blacks had to be in their neighborhood after dark or were harassed, stopped by the police and questioned and so forth. The Klan was very active in the 1920s here. We recently discovered this in the archives of the Lake Worth Museum. The Klan was boasting that Lake Worth was an all-white town. Welcome to Lake Worth. So the Klan was out from under their hoods at this period. They ran a school and a kindergarten and boasted about this in national Klan publications. And they owned property under the interesting name, the All-American Club. So in case that rings a bell with anybody. Fannie died, as we mentioned, in this accident in 1915 on the road to West Palm Beach. But she was well beloved, as this article states, in the community, and she was a business person and very active in the business community, loaned money to start the Bank of Lake Worth and those sort of things. So this is her obituary on her passing. And her estate, as we mentioned, was large. She had over $6,000 in loans and still owned property. and I'd have the 41 chickens and a rooster and upholstered furniture in her house and so forth. So she was successful. Her cousins from Ohio and Tennessee came down as her executors to settle her affairs. And some of the other neighbors, we're going to go through this kind of quick for the sake of time, but included the Stites, who was a family from Pennsylvania that we'll look at. William Steffen was a German immigrant who they were quite close to, and the Gudmundsons were another foreign family, a Scandinavian family, Swedish family that took out property on the southern end of what was to become Lake Worth. So we've talked a little bit about the Bradleys, really interesting biography there. They came down from Chicago. He had experience as a newspaper reporter in Chicago and wrote for the Tropical Sun paper while he was here. He lived in what he called Lotus Cove, between what was to become Lake Worth and Lantana, farming from the 1870s, and he had 4 kids. And interestingly enough, he served as superintendent of schools, helped to build the first schoolhouse in Lantana, and it got too crowded for him by 1910, and he moved to the Keys. His son Guy came to national recognition, was a game warden dealing with plume hunters down in the Everglades. He was killed in the line of duty and stirred quite a conservation movement. He became a martyr for the conservation movement and quite famous at that time. As I said, there's the masthead for the Tropical Sun, agricultural community, and the location of their homestead. So we can see from this map, it was actually south of Lake Worth, south of 18th Avenue South, just barely outside the city limits. And his property was down to Lantana Road on the cove that he called Lotus Cove. And as we said, he wrote for the paper, and he liked to use Latin phrases. He was quite a colorful gentleman, and it's very fortunate that we have these records. Details about his son's hunting that made the local paper, picture of the first schoolhouse. Notice how similar this was to the James's house. It's basically a square building unadorned. Michael Merkle was another neighbor. Again, an interesting character, a German immigrant who lived alone out on Lake Osborne in a lean-to, eating fish and berries. And he was known to walk around in the woods muttering in Latin. The rumor was that he was a defrocked Catholic priest who was doing penance out here in the wilderness. He was a friend of the Jameses, and he signed several legal documents in their behalf, citing Jewell as his place of residence. And that star shows approximately where he lived on Lake Osborne, separate from even the scattered agricultural homesteads that existed at that time. And here's just a remark that made the paper on him. He ate some Japanese beans and he got sick. One more famous couple that we're going to talk about, Dr. Harry Stites, came down with 3 childhood friends from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania area. He was a medical doctor, quite a restless soul. He had served as an Indian agent in the Lakota Territory in North Dakota and also in Montana. And he was there, and then he went back to Harrisburg, and then he came down here to South Florida, sailing down with some of his childhood friends. And he was the only one that stayed. When West Palm Beach was established with the advent of the train, he moved to West Palm and became a medical doctor there. And he worked for Flagler's railroad as a physician. But then he died in Cuba. So he was, as I said, a restless soul. We have interesting documentation of his marriage. He got married on July 4th, 1876. So at the centenary of the country, and his wife was pretty well-to-do herself. Her father was a doctor. Her maiden name was Singer, and they had quite the wedding up in Pennsylvania. They also had children, two of whom were young and came to Florida with them. And their homestead is now where the Lake Worth golf course is, between 7th Avenue North, which would be where the clubhouse is going north. And that was their approximately 160-acre homestead plot. And this is an early picture we have of a story-and-a-half wood frame house with a gabled roof. And notice Maisie, his wife, in a white outfit with a white hat on, posing in this photograph. And we have Ginger Pedersen to thank for having gone, I think, with Janet, who's with us tonight, going up to the archive and actually getting a better copy than we were able to get from the electronic copy. And it shows the details of Maisie in the house much better. So we can be grateful for that. This was taken in 1886. So the Stites family was down here just shortly after the Jameses. There was a land dispute between some of Dr. Stites' friends. They tried to take some of the Jameses' land on the southern end of their claim, but the case went to district court. And it's really interesting in this era where race was becoming an issue in the wider country, that all of Samuel and Fannie's neighbors testified in their behalf that they were the legitimate owners of this land and these newcomers weren't entitled to it. And so it's interesting that race was not an issue that divided the Jameses from their neighbors, even going back to the 1880s. And then the developer came in, established, started to buy up the land and sell off town lots under the name of Bryant and Greenwood, or the Palm Beach Farms Company. And here's their sales building, which was located Dixie Highway and Lake Avenue. So the town is starting to come out of the Everglades at this time. The first post office, just give you some quick pictures of what the town looked like. Fannie was still alive at this time, so she was able to experience the early growth of the town. By the end of 1912, there was a census, and there were already 308 residents who had moved in between May and December of that year. So the town really came to be fast, and we have a complete list of all the residents and their lots from the Lake Worth Herald that began publishing also in May of 1912. And Lake Avenue under construction, and recreational facilities that in the clubhouse. This is the current site of the city hall. It was a public park at that time. Schools opened, of course, all white school. And there was that was the original city hall. I had a jail and the police department, the fire department, and the library all under one roof at that early stage. And so that's a brief history of the Jewell up to the time of Fannie's death. We had talked about this mural that Tracy Peterson, who's with us this evening, is working on with the Historical Society. It's a gorgeous, colorful mural depicting not only the first post office in the center and Fannie James with the barefoot mailman, but also community of Seminole up in the upper left there, the wildlife, and the mixed community that existed here at that time with some of the other settlers in the upper right hand. And so this is designed to be an educational tool with legends for school kids and so forth. So we're looking forward to in the next month or so of having this made public. So one more discovery I'd like to share with you, that on ancestry.com, we were actually able to locate, with the help of Scott McCabe, who was the original journalist at the Palm Beach Post and now lives in Washington, D.C. area. But he found this April, who is a descendant of one of Fannie's cousins or nephews that would be and the executor of his estate, A.T.B. Jones. And April actually came down and met us and posed in front of the memorial, and it was wonderful to get to know her, and we hope, of course, that she'll come for the dedication of the mural. So in sum, we appreciate Lake Worth for its diversity. It has this wonderful heritage of welcoming people from around the world to live here, and we all celebrate that fact today, despite the existence of that segregation period and the influence of Jim Crow in the 1920s. And one of the ways we mark that is with this memorial to Dr. King in the Cultural Plaza. So with that, I hope you found that interesting, and be a good time to open up to any questions. It might be easiest to go ahead and type your questions in the chat, huh? So if you have a question, please feel free to type it in there and we'll answer that. Tracy, are you with us? See if we can.
Yes.
Unmute her. Okay. If you want to say something about your experience in designing and executing the Jewell community mural.
Oh, okay, sure.
When you're doing that, people can type out their questions.
Yeah. Thank you. I was just curious that I have a question first. Are some of that information you just presented is new stuff since you wrote the book?
Yes. For example, the information about Fannie's brother-in-law who died in the Civil War, and the fact that she had signed the application for pension benefits for her sister and was in Ohio at the time. We suspected her family went to Ohio. We suspected that she probably accompanied them, but we didn't know that she had actually gone to Ohio, and that she was already married by 1868. That was 12 years before she shows up in the census in Tallahassee. So we still don't know when they got married or how they met, and hoping that some information will come up. But that's just one tidbit that came to light. Also, some of the names and biographies of the first residents of the Osborne community was new information that's been discovered since the book was published in 2013. Again, I think it was Marion Cohn from our board, Historical Society board, who found those clippings in the Lake Worth Herald, and lots of other little tidbits here and there. Yeah, including Fannie's genealogy, her descendants, all that, of course, is new since the book.
Ted, this is Steve. I have a question.
Sure, if I can.
Looking through old commercial records, it looks like there were several attempts of developers like the Palm Beach Farm Company, sort of out of town developers, to develop all Black communities in the region. I don't know whether any of them actually lasted, but I've seen 3 or 4 advertisements in magazines at the time and newspapers for, I guess I call them colored communities at the time. Can you comment on that?
Yes, all of the municipalities along the coast here followed pretty much the same blueprint, is that they had segregated housing after a period of time. Initially, no, people lived mixed together, and then after the communities grew, they established white residential communities and Black residential communities like Pleasant City and West Palm Beach. And so there were all Black communities within the municipality of West Palm. There were, of course, champions of the Black cause that felt like Blacks would be better off having not only financial independence in their own farms, but having their own city governments and so forth. For example, we mentioned how the Osborne community was sand streets and poor city services and a lot of inequities. So this was a dream, as far as we know, and speculation to form them. But as far as I know, there were no all Black communities incorporated in South Florida. So then, as we mentioned, there were colored residential areas, as it was called at that time, in up and down the coast in Boynton Beach, Delray, West Palm Beach, but Lantana and Lake Worth were all white communities for a period of time. Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Deborah. I just posted a question, but I can ask it directly.
Sure, go ahead.
I wrote that our city is one of artists, and we're also one of diversity. Has anyone considered a plan to create a more significant jewel marker west of the post office? Like maybe to do a grant or a call for artists as some kind of sculpture or something, because that area could really use it. And I think it would be amazing. I'm sure others have thought of it, like other than something that's just on the ground, something a little more prominent.
Right. Well, the mural that Tracy has been working on is planned to be mounted in that picnic shelter that we showed you in South Bryant Park, which will be to the site of the original post office and why it's there. Also, Judy Reed from our board has worked with the State Historical Society on a historical marker, one of those large roadside type markers that will go to mark the site.
I see.
And then there's the mural that we showed that's on in the Osborne community, marking close to the site of Fannie's third homestead. I'm sure sculpture or any other works. The Jewell has been a known name. The Downtown Jewell Neighborhood Association took their name, from the Jewell, and it's part of our heritage. And over the last few years, it seemed like that has grown in awareness in many ways, and I'm sure that any proposals for furtherly, enhancing that heritage would be welcome.
I think I might look into that. I've always passed it, and it took me several times going past before I actually stopped and looked at it, and it really touched me. And I think it needs more credit where credit is due, and perhaps being that I can't wait to see the mural. I absolutely can't wait. I think with that combination and something that's an ode to right at that intersection will be amazing. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Sure. Great, thank you. Any other questions?
Ted, you might want to mention about that you're having the educational boards made up, and that, and about the mural, the images.
Well, part of our process of working on the mural, Tracy has her studio in her home, and she's welcomed in the commission and the mayor and the city manager, and everybody was very excited about it. But it's a 12x4 mural. It's rather large. Somebody, one of the commissioners suggested putting it in front of the dais, taking over the whole front of the dais, or hanging it in the hallway, which would of course be appropriate to mark the Jewell that way, but it is quite large. So the idea of getting a high quality photographic reproduction and doing half size, 6x2, that could hang more like a picture on the wall. It could also be used in schools as either permanent or traveling display for educational purposes. And so a lot of programming could be done by the society and the Board of Education.
That'd be amazing.
And others around this mural. It does have explanatory legends all the way through it. So it is a good educational tool. It was designed with that in mind.
Can you say again, I'm sorry, I missed exactly where it's going to be in Bryant?
Right, all the way south in Bryant Park.
Right.
And so if you just go all the way down along the seawall there,
Yeah.
so the birthday cake castle.
Right.
Picnic shelter right there, where the playground is, with that climbing globe, and
perfect.
That is close to within 100 feet of the original site of the Jewell Post Office.
Oh, that gives chills.
So
That's wonderful.
That's exactly where the mural will be hung.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's great.
Hey, Ted, this is Steve. Before we close, and this is a fantastic presentation, and the fact that your work continues and expands means we'll probably have to have you back in a couple of years for the next episode. But since this is Black History Month, would you comment briefly? I know that you're heavily involved with the Lake Worth Interfaith Network, and they have a website, 28 days, since this is Black History Month. Could you just tell people what that is and how they could access it?
Sure. So as those of you who have lived in Lake Worth know, we've had a very strong Martin Luther King celebration in January every year. And the MLK committee has expanded that very often into the month of February for Black History Month. And so many of us wear multiple hats in the city. So I've been on that MLK committee for a number of years. And we've coordinated with the Interfaith Network and the Historical Society to do a 28-day of awareness of anti-racism or healing racism. So there is both on our website, on the Lake Worth Interfaith Network website, which you could easily Google, or the Facebook page dedicated to the 28-day campaign. Every day there have been stories about Black history, quotes from Black authors, interfaith quotes relative to racial equality, as well as things to do in the city of Lake Worth, murals to visit, historic sites to visit, and things to do supporting Black businesses and restaurants, for example. And so something's coming out every day. Of course, we're 24 days into the 28 days now, but things are, new postings are coming out every day. So again, it's both on Facebook under 28 Days of Anti-Racism, and also on the Interfaith Network website. So please feel free to join, like, share, and get another taste of some of our rich history. I was wondering if Janet, I see that you're with us, and I know you're the historian. Do you have anything to share with us? You can unmute yourself if you care to, or you can pass. Didn't mean to.
Oh,
Put you on the spot.
no, thank you. You did a great job, Ted. I do have one funny comment though. I had said I was from Boynton, but I'm living in Lantana, and I actually live on Old Man Bradley's property.
There you go. So you're north of Lantana Road then, huh?
Yeah, so that was a great connection. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. No, he was one of the very early settlers in the area.
Okay, well, it's been a great evening together. I like all of us, I regret the fact that we're not, together face to face, and certainly look forward to getting back to that situation again next year. I want to remind you that our next presentation is March, what, Judy? March 11th?
I should have mentioned, Steve, that the book Pioneers of Jewell is available from the Cultural Council and also on Amazon. Usually when we have these events, we have book signings and the books are available. And of course, due to the virtual environment, we can't do that. But the book is available for purchase online.
Yes, March 11th, if you can, March 11th is our next presentation with Dorothy Block, the anthropologist who's done the groundbreaking work on the pre-Columbian sites in Lake Worth Beach. I think you'll find it very fascinating because a lot of the discoveries of what we now know to be, for example, pre-Columbian mounds took place just as the city was being developed, and mounds were, dug up and destroyed as part of development. But there was some documentation. I think you'll find the evening very, very interesting. March 11th, and we'll be posting the Zoom site on our website or Facebook page and through our mailing list. So Thank you all for joining us this evening, and hope you have a great week.
May I say one thing? If anyone wants to email me directly, I'll make sure that you get your information and your links as soon as possible for the next program. And my personal email is reedjudy@hotmail.com.
Fantastic. Thank you, Judy.
You're welcome. By
Good
the
night.
way, I see Ed Lamott's with us, and I know Ed has an upcoming program he might like to mention. Not sure.
Ed, are you there? Maybe not.
Maybe
Okay.
he took off on us. There he is.
Okay. Thanks a lot, and good night, everybody.
Thank you. It was great. Bye.
Bye-bye, thanks.
Bye.